It was meant to be a new beginning. That's what Dad kept telling us as we packed up our life in Grand Rapids, stuffing everything we owned into a U-Haul. A fresh start, a chance to live a simpler life, away from the noise and the stress of the city. We'd be living off the land, growing our own food, raising animals. It would be hard work, but it would be ours. I didn't buy it for a second. We didn't move to the middle of nowhere because it was a dream of self-sufficiency. We moved because we had no other choice. Dad lost his job, and the bills piled up faster than he and Mom could keep up with. The bank took our house, and we sold off what we could to scrape together enough to buy this old farmhouse in the middle of rural Michigan. Trout Lake was the nearest town, a 40-minute drive away, and calling it a town was being generous. It was more like a gas station, a post office, and a couple of rundown shops. The place we ended up with was miles away from even that, a crumbling old house sitting on 24 acres of overgrown farmland, surrounded by dense, dark woods. Mom and Dad were trying to put on a brave face, talking about how exciting it would be to grow our own food, to raise chickens, goats, and pigs. But I could see the worry etched into their faces, the way they flinched whenever the word bills came up. This wasn't the life they wanted. It was the life they were stuck with. And me? I was just trying to survive my senior year. I should have been back in Grand Rapids, hanging out with my friends, going to parties, looking forward to graduation. Instead, I was stuck out here, miles from anything, with nothing but trees and fields to keep me company. The only upside was that I convinced my parents to let me finish school online. I wasn't about to start over at some tiny backwoods school where everyone already knew each other, and I'd just be the weird new kid from the city. So I spent most of my time in my room, staring at my laptop, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing about this place felt right. We moved in late summer when the days were long and the nights were warm. The house was old, creaky, and smelled like mildew and dust, but Mom and Dad threw themselves into fixing it up, determined to make it work. They built a chicken coop, set up the barn for goats and pigs, and even brought home a dog, a big burly pit bull Rottweiler mix we named Blue. He was supposed to be our protector, but even he seemed uneasy, always sticking close to the house, never wandering far. At first, it was just small things that felt off. The way the trees seemed to lean in closer, the way the wind howled through the eaves at night, the way the darkness seemed thicker out here, more suffocating. But then things started getting worse. It started with the chickens. Dad woke up one morning to find the coop destroyed, the wire mesh ripped apart. The wood splintered like something huge had crashed through it. Every single chicken was dead, their bodies torn to pieces, feathers and blood scattered all over the yard. It wasn't just an animal attack. It was carnage. Dad tried to brush it off, saying it must have been a fox or maybe a raccoon that got into the coop, but we both knew that was bullshit. No fox could have done that. No raccoon either. Whatever it was big, strong, and vicious. A few days later, it was the goats. I'll never forget the sound of Mom's scream when she found them. They were in the barn, or what was left of them. The doors were smashed open, the hay was soaked in blood, and the goats, they were torn apart, their bodies shredded, their insides strewn across the floor. It was like something had taken its time with them, savoring the kill. Dad tried to keep us calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was trying to protect us, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. He called the local police, but they were no help. They took a report, mumbled something about coyotes, and left. But I could tell they didn't believe it either. Whatever did this wasn't a coyote. It wasn't anything they wanted to deal with. The pigs went next. Same story. Something broke into the barn and tore them to pieces, leaving nothing but blood and bones behind. By this point, we were all on edge. Blue wouldn't leave the house unless one of us was with him, and even then he was jumpy, his ears flat against his skull, his tail tucked between his legs. At night, he'd bark at the windows, growling at something none of us could see, It drove Mom crazy, the way he'd stand at the door, barking into the darkness. One night, Dad finally had enough. He took Blue outside and chained him to a tree, figuring that would stop the barking. It did. But when we woke up the next morning, Blue was gone. His chain had been snapped in half and there was no sign of him. That night I started hearing the howling. It came from deep in the woods, low and mournful, like the sound of something hunting. It echoed through the trees, growing louder and closer as the night wore on. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding, the sound filling my head. I kept telling myself it was just wolves, maybe coyotes, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I knew it was something else. The eyes came next. At first, they were just at the edge of the tree line, far enough away that I could pretend they were something normal, deer maybe, or raccoons. But they were too high off the ground, too steady, too menacing. There were at least 8 of them, pairs of glowing eyes, watching the house from the shadows. They never came close enough for us to see what they belonged to, always staying just out of reach of the lights we had set up outside. But they were there every night, watching, waiting. Dad tried to brush it off, saying it was just wolves, that we were overreacting. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe it either. Everything came to a head when the storm hit. It was late October, and the snow came early, thick and heavy, covering everything in a blanket of white. The power lines went down, the roads closed, and we were trapped, isolated in our little farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The gas generator was our only lifeline, keeping the lights on, keeping the darkness at bay. That night, the eyes came back, but this time, there were more of them, at least 14 pairs glowing in the darkness, surrounding the house. And that's when I realized they weren't reflecting light. They were glowing on their own. Dad finally grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the woods, trying to get a better look. What we saw made my blood run cold. They weren't wolves. They weren't even close. They were massive, standing on 2 legs, their bodies covered in matted fur, their faces twisted into snarls, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. They were like something out of a nightmare, like the werewolves from the movies. But worse. So much worse. They were huge. 7, 8 feet tall, their limbs long and powerful, their claws gleaming in the light of the flashlight. The moment the light hit them, they moved, darting out of the beam, staying just out of reach. But closer now, close enough that I could hear their growls, deep and guttural. Close enough that I could see their teeth, long and sharp, dripping with saliva. Panic set in. We knew they were coming for us. We knew it was only a matter of time. Dad and I took turns fueling the generator, trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep them at bay. But the gas was running low, and we both knew it wouldn't last. We had maybe an hour, maybe less, before the lights went out and the darkness swallowed us whole. Finally, the gas ran out. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out, plunging us into total darkness. And that's when they attacked. The sound was deafening. The crash of windows shattering, the splintering of wood as they tore through the doors, the growls and snarls as they swarmed into the house. Dad grabbed his shotgun, firing into the darkness, the blasts lighting up the room for brief, terrifying moments. I saw them, saw the way they moved, fast and fluid, their eyes burning with rage, their claws tearing through furniture, through walls, through flesh. Mom screamed, and I turned to see one of them grab her, its claws sinking into her arm, dragging her toward the door. Dad fired again, but it was too late. They were on him, pulling him to the ground, ripping into him with teeth and claws, tearing him apart. I watched in horror as they dragged his body outside, the snow turning red with his blood, his screams cut short as they tore him to pieces. Mom was next. She fought, kicking and screaming, but they were too strong. They dragged her out the door into the snow-covered yard. The last thing I saw before they disappeared into the woods was her hand reaching out toward me, her screams echoing through the night. Then they were gone, swallowed by the trees, taking her with them. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The house was in shambles, the walls splintered, the windows shattered, snow and blood mixing on the floor. The smell of death hung in the air, thick and rancid, mingling with the coppery scent of blood. My father was gone, my mother was gone, and I was alone. But I couldn't afford to stay frozen. The creatures, the dogmen, weren't finished. I could hear them moving around the house, their heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, their guttural growls sending shivers down my spine. They were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I grabbed the shotgun from where my dad had dropped it, my hands shaking as I loaded it with the last of the shells. I knew it wouldn't be enough, knew I didn't stand a chance against them. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I wasn't going to let them take me without a struggle. I barricaded myself in the living room, dragging what was left of the furniture in front of the broken windows, blocking the doors as best I could. The snowstorm raged outside, the wind howling through the shattered glass, whipping the curtains into a frenzy. The generator was dead, and the only light came from the dim glow of the snow outside, casting eerie shadows across the room. The growls grew louder, closer. They were coming back. I gripped the shotgun, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, how to survive. But I knew there was no escape. The nearest town was 40 minutes away. The roads were closed, and I was trapped in a house surrounded by monsters. The first one appeared at the window, its massive frame filling the shattered opening, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It snarled, baring its teeth, and I fired, the blast lighting up the room for a split second. The creature staggered back, howling in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Another one appeared at the door, slamming against the barricade, the wood splintering under the force of its blows. I fired again, but the shells were running low. There were too many of them, and they were too strong. They were inside the house now, tearing through the walls, ripping apart the furniture, their eyes fixed on me, their growls filling the air. I knew I couldn't hold them off much longer. The barricade at the door gave way, and they burst through, their massive bodies filling the room. I fired the last shell, hitting one of them square in the chest, but it barely slowed it down. They were on me in seconds, their claws ripping into my flesh, their teeth sinking into my skin. The pain was unbearable, a searing agony that tore through my body, but I fought back with everything I had, swinging the shotgun like a club, kicking, screaming. But it was no use. They were too strong, too fast. One of them grabbed me, its claws digging into my shoulders, lifting me off the ground. I felt its hot breath on my face, smelled the rancid stench of decay as it opened its jaws, ready to tear into me. But then, something changed. The first rays of the sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a pale light over the snow-covered yard. The dogmen froze, their eyes widening in fear, their growls turning into whines. The one holding me dropped me to the floor, backing away, its body trembling. They retreated, slinking back into the shadows, their glowing eyes fading as they disappeared into the woods, taking my mother with them. I lay on the floor, bleeding, broken, but alive. The storm had passed, the sun was rising, and the dogmen were gone. But the horror wasn't over. My parents were dead, my home destroyed, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the memories of that night to keep me company. The police arrived hours later, after I somehow managed to crawl to the road and flag down a passing car. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? The official story was that a pack of wolves had attacked the house, killing my parents. The bodies were never found, and I was lucky to have survived, they said. The investigation was brief, cursory, Wolves are a protected species, after all, and the matter was quickly referred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But I knew the truth. No one else did. No one else could. Not the police, not the doctors, not the reporters who swarmed the farm the next day, eager for a story. They didn't believe me, didn't believe in monsters, in the things that go bump in the night. And why would they? It was easier to blame it on wolves, on a tragic accident, than to face the reality of what was really out there. I was sent to live with my grandparents near Round Lake Beach, Illinois. They tried to comfort me, tried to make me feel at home, but nothing could fill the void left by my parents, by the terror I'd faced. I barely spoke, barely ate, barely slept. The nightmares were constant, vivid. The memories of that night playing over and over in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The Dogmen, their glowing eyes, their snarls, the way they tore my parents apart. The only person I ever told the full story to was my therapist. She listened patiently, nodding, taking notes, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. She didn't believe me. Not really. She chalked it up to trauma, to the mind's way of coping with something too horrific to comprehend. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. The only person who believed me was my fiancée. She listened, held my hand, and told me she believed me, that she knew I was telling the truth. It was the only thing that kept me going, the only thing that kept me from losing my mind completely. But even with her, the memories were too much, too painful to talk about for long. We don't speak of it often. We don't need to. The scars are there, even if the words aren't. I've tried to move on, to build a new life, but the memories still haunt me. I wake up most nights in a cold sweat, the echoes of growls and screams ringing in my ears. I can still feel their claws, their teeth, the way they tore through the house like it was made of paper, the way they took everything from me. I know they're still out there, in those woods, waiting, watching. I know they'll never stop. And I know that no matter how far I run, how hard I try to forget, they'll always be with me, lurking in the shadows of my mind. Because some things can't be forgotten. Some nightmares never end.